Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the For a Better Web podcast, in which I, Bruce Lawson, technical communications officer at the Vivaldi browser, talk to somebody who, in their own way, in their own industry, is working to make the web a better place. And this time, it's my great pleasure to be talking to Andy Yen, the CEO of Proton. Hello, Andy.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for having me. It's good to be on the show.
It's great for you to be here too. I should say to our listeners, full disclosure, Proton and Vivaldi have a relationship because if you're a Vivaldi user, you'll know that we recently integrated Proton's free VPN into Vivaldi desktop. But I've been wanting to speak to Andy for a long time. I've been a Proton user for quite a long time now on the recommendation of my cousin, who's a VPN researcher. So just putting that out there so you know the relationship between us folks. So, Andy, you are a physicist, I believe. You were working at CERN. So how are you running a VPN?
Well, I think Proton is much more than a VPN. It didn't
Of
start with a
course.
VPN, actually. I think the connection between CERN and the web actually goes quite far back, right? If you
Hmm.
recall, back in 1991, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, when he invented the web, was actually working at CERN. So there's
Hmm.
always been an intersection between science and technology, and CERN in particular, because of the massive amounts of data that we deal with,
Hmm.
and the infrastructure that is built to support that, actually has a very good connection. So I would say that working in science, the topics around privacy, security, these are things that come about because as a scientist, well, you don't go into science to make money, right? I can tell you there's not a lot of money in science. You do it because you want to work on some of the world's most interesting problems, some of the world's most difficult problems that you think actually benefit society. And if I look at society today, especially back in 2014 when we started the company, one of the big things was, well, the web as we know it is sort of going in the wrong direction, right?
Hmm.
It's something that is increasingly monopolized by a few big tech companies that really don't have the best interests of society and users at heart. So our challenge, our motivation was to figure out how can we build a different model of operating online, which goes against that and actually brings privacy, freedom, and choice back to internet users.
That's cool. And were you a physicist at CERN? Were you working on small particles?
Yeah, actually, I was a particle physicist, and I was working on a part of particle physics called supersymmetry.
Mm.
And so, actually, yeah, my PhD is in physics, indeed. And I guess I'm one of the many physicists that ended up in tech. It's quite interesting because had we found supersymmetry and had we found new physics at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN back in those days, probably proton wouldn't exist, right? Probably we would all be professors somewhere doing research into new physics. But it turns out that the nature of the universe was that the LHC, the machine that we're working on, was not big enough to discover new physics.
Hmm.
So in some ways, the nature of the universe caused Proton, the company, to be created because all these great scientists suddenly had a lot of free time, right? Or the field was less exciting, after we didn't make the discoveries that we were hoping to make.
Gotcha. And is that why Proton is called Proton, as a nod to the Large Hadron Collider?
Yeah, it's correct because it's the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider. It's actually a proton-proton collider. So we were smashing
Hmm.
protons, and we thought, okay, well, that's a good name. Let's use that.
Great, thank you. I love theoretical physics, even though my degree's drama and English literature, so I have no mathematic ability, but I'm fascinated by it. In fact, D.H. Lawrence wrote a poem about relativity in the late 20s, interestingly. Anyway, I know nothing at all about the tech um, behind VPNs, and I know Proton isn't only a VPN, it's how I first encountered you. So I asked an expert, my cousin Simon Miliano from Top 10 VPN, for a tech question. And he said, ask Andy this. The VPN space is full of marketing claims that don't hold up under scrutiny. What should users demand as proof of trustworthiness in a VPN? And how does Proton VPN meet that bar?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. It's fascinating because if you look at the VPN industry today, I would say most of those businesses are not tech businesses, right?
Hmm.
They're probably marketing businesses,
Hmm.
and in many cases, exceptionally good ones at that. And I think in some ways that's always been what has made Proton different. Fundamentally, when it comes to a VPN, what you're doing is you're saying, I don't trust my internet service provider, and I'm going to trust some other guys, right?
Hmm.
And the other guys is the VPN company. And it's interesting because a lot of these VPN companies out there, you don't even really know who runs it, right?
Hmm.
And then when you do discover who runs it, you probably think to yourself, well, these guys probably shouldn't be running a VPN because I can't trust them at all. And it's interesting if you dig in a lot of VPN companies, there's a lot of stories of people that were from the ad tech or malware space that decided to go into VPNs, right? Which doesn't make any sense. So software at the end of the day, we think about it as code, but actually you're trusting, who writes the software. So I think one of the key things that's very important is you need to look at who is building the software that you're running, what is their motivation, what is their credentials, and why they're actually, credible in doing what they're doing. So I would say in the VPN space, look at who's behind a VPN company. This is the key thing, right? In a lot of cases, you can't even find it, which is,
Hmm.
the first problem. But beyond that, I think it's also important to use VPNs that are open source. So you can actually validate, that it's actually working as advertised,
Hmm.
and that and there's a level of transparency that comes from having clear ownership, clear disclosure of who's behind it, and clear ability to inspect the code. That I think are very that is very essential because VPN at the end of the day, it's a trust business, and trust comes from transparency.
Yeah, yeah, and same with browsers, same with almost anything that sits between you and the wider web out there. So, if it's to do with researching credentials, is that you've got to be pretty savvy to know how to do that. And VPNs are becoming more and more mainstream. It used to be computer geeks only, but now more and more people, normal users, regular users, are using VPNs. Is there any sort of magic thing they can do to find out the credentials, or is it just
Mm,
Googling, Binging,
yeah.
Yahooing?
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting space as well, in this regard, because a lot of it's just publicly out there now, right? A lot of the, let's say, um, most well-known sites that review VPNs are actually themselves owned by the VPN companies, right? And there's a few prominent examples of this out there in the industry.
Hmm.
So then it's a question of who can you trust anymore, right? Then you might say, oh, maybe I'll go to my YouTube influencers, but half of them are paid off by VPN companies as well, right? If you've been on YouTube, you've seen all the ads. So I do think there's a big credibility gap, right? About who you can believe, because in fact, advertising is so subtle these days that you're not sure if they're saying it because it's true or they're saying it because they've been paid to say it. And yeah, so this is why I think it's important for users to be savvy, right? You've got to do a bit of digging, try to understand a bit the space. And I think also do your best to research who's behind these companies, right?
Hmm.
And don't just click on the first link that you find online, because odds are that it's not an impartial review, right? And yeah, so I think it's a bit too bad that this is the nature of internet today. It's not just VPNs actually, but whether antivirus or any other business out there, it's kind of the same, right? We've sort of lost the really truly impartial reviews, and so I think this is why word of mouth, talking to experts I knew. I think everybody always has that one friend they know who is the person that knows all the tech things, right? Ask that person, right? Because he probably has done more research. But yeah, I do think consumers today have to be careful about who they pick, whether it's your browser, whether it's your VPN, whether it's email service. There's usually more than meets the eye.
And in answer, I guess the second part of that question, how does Proton meet the bar? I suppose you've kind of answered it in the sense in that you've said the source code is open source, and whereas not everybody is adept at reading C++
Mhm.
or something, the fact that you put the source code out there indicates, that uh, a, a wish for transparency. And also, you are a not-for-profit, I believe. Is that
Mhm.
correct?
Yes, that's correct. And actually, open source, you know, the benefit of open source is not that you personally can go and inspect the code and understand it, because odds are that you can't, right? The benefit of open source is that anybody that wants to can go and inspect the code and look at it themselves. And even if you yourself cannot read the code, it's very likely that among the 8 billion inhabitants of Earth, there is someone out there who can read it and has done it. And if you're a big enough VPN player, and there's something hiding in your code that is, let's say, not kosher, it's going to get found if it's open source code. So I think open source, even if you personally cannot read the code, is still extremely valuable, for that reason. And I think also, Proton structure is also something that's quite unique in this space. Today, the main shareholder of Proton, actually the controlling shareholder, is the Proton Foundation. That's a nonprofit that's based here in Geneva, Switzerland, whose mission is actually to further online freedom, privacy, and democracy. And this, I think, is something quite important, because today your data online, actually, it's being sold to the highest bidder, right? Even a company that is a privacy company could get sold to a bigger company that doesn't care about your privacy anymore. And I think an example of this is, recently 23andMe went bankrupt in the US, right? That's a DNA testing company. Well, guess what? In a bankruptcy, the highest bidder bought your DNA data, right? So I think the fact that we're a foundation means that it has a long-term guarantee that actually Proton cannot be sold, because the foundation's mission does not allow it to sell it to the highest bidder. And this is sort of the strongest reassurance that you can possibly have, right? Anybody else out there that's in the VPN space or in the privacy space, actually they're going to be for sale eventually. And I think we did that structure because it's the only way to ensure in the long run, doesn't matter what happens to me or the other people in the company, the foundation will always be here, always ready to defend the mission and defend user data in the long run.
You sound very passionate about this, Andy. What drives your passion for transparency? And you mentioned democracy 2 or 3 times. What is it that drives you personally?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, I'm a scientist originally, and I think no matter what you do in life, you always stay kind of a scientist. And if you know about science, the core essence of science is peer review, right? It is coming up with an idea, but then having other people validate it by publishing your work openly, so that the rest of the world can challenge, discuss, and validate the research that you have done. And today, if you look at Proton's office here in Geneva, for example, probably a third of the engineers here came from CERN. They're scientists as well. So I think that scientific ethos is very strongly in our culture. And this is why we're transparent. This is why we're open. This is why we publish what we have done. This is why we publish our code, because that is simply the way that we've always lived our lives, right? If I zoom out a little bit more, I think there's maybe 2 other things that motivate me, right? One, I'm originally from Taiwan, and that is quite close to a neighboring country called China. And
I've heard of it.
yeah, and if you're neighbors to China, and technically still at war, in fact, right? Because the war was never settled. You understand very quickly, how freedom can disappear if there's no privacy, and how democracy is not something that you take for granted. So I think that background also makes me maybe a bit more sensitive to these issues, and this is why I believe strongly in privacy, freedom, and democracy, because I think actually the 3 things are entirely linked. So I think that's definitely one factor. The other factor that really motivates me is, if I were to go out today and talk to the average, online internet user, which is basically everybody today, right? And I were to give them, Google's vision of the web, and also share with them Proton's vision of the web, I would wager that probably 9 out of 10, or maybe even 99 out of 100, would say that they're more strongly aligned with Proton's vision of what the web and what the internet can and should be. And that is, for me, extremely motivating, because from that alone, I think in the long run, we're going to win. And it's a lot more, let's say, easy to get motivated for a fight if you believe that you can win it. And I do think that we can win it in the long run, because the vision that we have of how the web should be, this is what consumers actually want. And so, now we just have to work hard to make it, possible, right?
Music to my ears. So one of the reasons that you're so strongly into transparency and openness is because of the scientific method, because it depends upon attempts to falsify hypotheses. And if you can't access the methods and the results and the experimentation documentation, you can't do science, I guess.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So is that why your Proton is headquartered in Switzerland now? Because that's where CERN is, and it was easy to get people, or is there something specific about Swiss, historic neutrality, Swiss
Yeah.
civic society that made you want to be there?
Yeah. Well, it was almost kind of a historical accident in a sense, because Proton was, in fact, built. The first version of Proton Mail was coded up in the CERN cafeteria, right? So we were already here, and when we needed to decide where should we place the company in order to give the best protection for users, and you look at all the legislation that exists in the world, actually Switzerland was one of the best locations. Now, you can probably find one or two, random countries somewhere where there's a total lack of regulation, where anything goes, that, maybe even more private, on paper, but they're not places that you could credibly run a business, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's also some folks that say, oh, maybe you should put your business, offshore somewhere on a Caribbean island, or, 15 miles from the nearest landmass, right? But that's not practical either. So in terms of, say, well-developed countries that have the scale, but also the legislative framework that allows privacy services like Proton, which are based on trust, to really, let's say, service users globally in a very good way. Switzerland is one of maybe a handful of countries that I think meets the criteria. So that was why at that point we decided, it makes sense to be here. But what I want to stress is I don't think you can, build your company fundamentally, around the laws, because laws can change and governments can change. It takes just an election, as we've, discovered in many countries around the world, right? So I would say that, the protection that you get from Proton is less about the laws of Switzerland and more about the laws of mathematics, the laws of encryption. Because I don't care, who wins the election, the laws of math are not going to change. And that's a guarantee that we want to give to our users.
So protected by the laws of maths, although talking of legislation, or at least ordinances and application of rules, I read recently that Switzerland looks like it's on the cusp of potentially a change in the regime of privacy and transparency. What can you tell us about that? Is it going to happen? Are you involved with that?
Yeah, it's an issue that we're watching very closely. What is going on is there is a proposal to revise the ordinance around surveillance. And what this revision would do is it would give the governments, of course, ability to request more data from companies like Proton, but it would also require us to retain metadata. So it would bring mandatory metadata retention into Switzerland. And for me, this is very troubling, because actually, today, mandatory metadata retention, this has been ruled illegal in Europe. It's not even done in the US, right? So Switzerland will be introducing something that on this continent, the only country that does it actually is Russia. And I think it's the wrong direction for the country, right? So obviously, at Proton, together with allies, we are fighting this. And we're fighting it now through the, let's say, through the public consultation that is being done. And we'll also fight it in the courts as well, right? Do I think this thing will, make it all the way through, passing the consultation and also passing the court challenge that we would mount? I would probably say, if I had a bet, no, right? But you're never sure, so you have to fight it anyways. And I do think it's important to fight measures like this, because you see more and more in different countries around the world, attempts to weaken encryption, attempts to, put more surveillance. And this is slippery slope. This is quite dangerous, and it simply doesn't end well, right? And the way to look at this is, let's say even if today you happen to trust your government, right? Well, a couple years from now, or a decade from now, maybe an election happens, and there's a government that you don't trust. Well, at that point, what are you going to do? Are you going to say, "Oh, I don't trust you anymore. I like to take back this power that I gave you 10 years ago"? That's never going to happen, right? So the only guarantee that us as citizens have that our data will, stay safe, is if we have a legal framework that protects us, irrespective of who is in power. And this is why I think legislation or changes in legislation and ordinances, which weaken encryption, it's something that it doesn't matter which political side you're on. It doesn't matter if your guy is in power today or not. We should all be incentivized to fight that.
Maybe this is asking you to speculate, but I imagine that the government has explained why it wants to change these ordinances. What is the impetus for this potential change?
Mhm. Well, actually, the way Switzerland works is these ordinances can come from an administrative unit, and someone simply makes a proposal to change it, and then it can kind of go under the radar and actually slip through all the way, right? So this is maybe, in my opinion, a failure of the Swiss way of doing ordinances, because you could really have just one insane person sitting in Bern come up with an extreme crackpot proposal, and that proposal could, if no one pays attention, go through and become adopted. And I think the way that I would look at this is, if you were to ask the policeman to write the rules, it shouldn't surprise you that you end up living in a police state, right? So what I think happened here was people, in fact, I know exactly who, was asked to update the rules. And this is someone with a very extreme view of surveillance. This is someone that would probably be a natural to work in Russia, for example, right? And he simply imprinted his extreme view onto the ordinance without any consideration at all to the economic, social, and political effects. And luckily, we were able to catch this, raise the alarm, make a lot of noise. And what is amazing is almost all the major political parties in Switzerland have now come out against this revision. And so hopefully we stop this thing. But I think this is why, in this space and as citizens, we need to be constantly vigilant, right? Because the instant we look away, something like this can slip through, and we got to pay attention. But yeah, if you let a policeman write the rules, don't be surprised to wake up in a police state. This is, I think, the simplest explanation of it.
Yeah, I hear you, and good luck with the fight. Here in the UK, our government is attempting to weaken encryption because child abusers sometimes send images through WhatsApp. Therefore, the government should be able to snoop on everybody's private messages. And if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear.
Yeah, and look, at Proton, actually, we take a very strict rule on this, right? Like, let's say we're not successful in fighting this, and this goes through. I've already stated publicly, and I'm happy to say it again. We will leave Switzerland if this passes, right? And I think actually it was important to say that, because that was what was could have been a technical issue that was ignored into a political issue. And I've been very, let's say, positively encouraged in the last few weeks and months to see sort of all the political and economic actors in Switzerland aligning around our positioning and fighting this. So I think we'll see in the next 6-12 months what happens. But if I had to bet, I would say that probably we will succeed in blocking this.
It's nice to see that Proton is fighting for what it believes, because a lot of tech companies fight for what they believe, but what they believe is basically the right to profit off other people's data. Vivaldi doesn't, and Proton doesn't. It would be wrong to characterize you as you personally as anti-regulation, though, wouldn't it? I believe you quite vehemently support regulation of tech. In fact, some people were surprised recently that you supported somebody called Gail Slater, who was a Republican nominee to lead antitrust in the US. Antitrust, of course, is a political hot topic globally. How does Proton, and how do you, Andy, navigate your way through the political turmoil that's going on at the moment? And what's your position on regulation and Ms. Slater?
Yeah, I think it's very tempting to say, oh, politics is a mess. Let's stay away and don't get involved at all, right? But I do think companies like Proton have to stay engaged,
Hmm.
and we cannot just bury our heads in the ground and say it doesn't matter if we don't care. It's whatever. So I would say it's absolutely essential that we politically engage, because that is the way in which policies are changed.
Hmm.
Now, U.S. politics is kind of it's interesting because it keeps flipping back and forth, Democrats, Republicans, right? And yeah, some people were surprised that I was supportive of a Republican nominee, but actually, in fairness, 4 years ago, I also supported the Democrat nominee, right? So had I not supported Gail Slater's nominee, maybe I would have been biased. But
Hmm.
I didn't support her actually because I wanted to be neutral, right, and to also back both sides. Now, I supported her because I actually think she's a good nominee.
Hmm.
And if you look at the confirmation, votes, she had, I think, 78 votes, in the U.S. Senate, which is ridiculous because nobody gets 78 votes in the U.S. Senate. It's completely divided. And what we saw was actually a lot of the Democrats who are, most strongly in support of regulating big tech companies and antitrust, like Elizabeth Warren, the senator.
Hmm.
She also voted to, support, Gail Slater. So it's not just my opinion. Actually, it's the opinion of quite a few, Democrats and Republicans that she's a good nominee. And what I find interesting is we used to think that, antitrust was kind of a partisan issue, right?
Hmm.
But actually, I think antitrust is a bit like privacy now. It's really something that people on both sides of the political spectrum should be able to support, because big tech companies being too big and dominating society and politics, this is not good for the world. And I don't think it matters whether you're Republican or Democrat. You should be willing to stand against that. And so, from that perspective, I think when you have people in government, irrespective of their party affiliation, that seem to be committed to doing the right thing and want to push through changes. And if you look at what's going on in the U.S. today, they are still litigating and taking legal action against big tech companies, right? Sure, now it's under the Trump administration that's doing that, but I think we should support that effort, because that effort is extremely important in creating, let's say, better internet economy for everybody. And I think there's been some interesting developments out of U.S. recently, and I think the US we have to pay attention to. We cannot ignore and disengage, because at the end of the day, these are American companies. And
Hmm.
I'll give you kind of an example, right? Apple and Google do this crazy thing where they're trying to take 30% fees of revenue from every payment that you collect on mobile, right? And of course, can you imagine an industry where you're trying to compete and you have to pay your biggest competitor 30% of your revenue? It's impossible, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And the European Union has been fighting this for probably 5 or 6 years now. They even passed a new legislation just to enforce this, right, called the Digital Markets Act.
Hmm.
And even with the new legislation and all the things they're doing here on this side, they still have not succeeded. What actually changed for the first time, was a court order in the U.S. against Apple. And
Yep.
that caused Apple to roll back its policies around 30% fees in the US, right? So I think this is evidence that actually a lot of these things, because these are American companies, have to start from the US. So if you believe in making a change here, it's not possible to disengage from the US. You've got to fight the fight there, because that is where you will, realistically speaking, have the biggest impact.
Personally, I completely agree. I've been fighting Apple and Microsoft now for 4 years. I engaged in a short-lived, interesting lockdown project to engage with the regulators. And that's been 4 years. But it seems ironic to me personally that we regard Europe as sort of the place where things are regulated to death, and we regard the states, and particularly, Mr. Trump and the Republicans, the place where they hate regulation and everything's going to be a free for all. But the most, the most, the most important acts have come from that Republican, or at least under the
Mhm.
Trump administration. He started the DOJ versus
Yes.
Google case in Trump won. I wish we were seeing similar stuff in the EU, personally.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I think the EU is trying its best,
Mm,
but they don't quite have the tools to do it. And you know, these companies are American companies, right? So they can very easily, or more easily, let's say, give the finger to EU regulators,
yeah.
but they cannot defy American court orders that easily. And this is what we saw in the Apple case. I think it's an interesting point you bring up because, indeed, the antitrust cases that you mentioned were started by the first Trump administration, but they were also continued by the Biden administration.
Hmm.
And now the second Trump administration is still pursuing them. And this is why I think we need to not make antitrust a political issue. It's like privacy. There should be a bipartisan consensus, regardless of your political leanings, that says this is something that we should pursue because it's good for society. And it's very hard in today's polarized world to find common ground, but I think that is one issue where it is possible to find common ground.
I agree. Personally, I think, and again, I'm speaking as Bruce rather than Vivaldi here, but personally, I think if you cannot support somebody because of the color of their political rosette, even if they're doing something good, that isn't neutrality. That's utter partisanship in and of itself. I'll support somebody who wants to do the right thing, regardless of what their political affiliation is, personally. But
Yeah. And I think that's the objective way to look at it. But of course, politics can also be very emotional, and
mhm,
it's hard to see reason sometimes, right? But indeed, I think as players who are in it for the long run, we have to stay very rational, and we have to take our wins when we can get them, right? It doesn't matter, kind of, which party they're with. And I would say, if you look at, just going back to kind of Bill Slater, right? Uh, that was probably one of the best possible picks that we could have gotten out of the possible roster of Republican, antitrust candidates, right? So I think, I'll take the wins when I get them because there aren't that many wins, to be honest.
there are not that many wins, but hopefully there'll be more. Apple likes to say, with the 30% App Store tax, Apple likes to say, well, it doesn't hurt consumers because developers pay. Now, you're a developer. What's Proton going to do now that you don't have to pay 30%
Yeah.
tax to Apple?
Well, that's a bit like, Trump saying tariffs don't hurt consumers because it's the companies that pay, right? There's no difference between Apple's, 30% tax and a tariff, right?
Hmm.
If you're charging companies, 30% more to sell stuff, there is no question that's going to get passed on to consumers, right? The idea that that companies can just absorb a 30% hit on their margins and just walk away, it's as absurd that as saying automakers are going to absorb 30% tariffs and not pass them on, right? So for sure, the Apple tax is paid by consumers, by American citizens, and this is why even if you're an Apple fan, you should be against the Apple tax, to be honest, right? Because it's going to reduce your prices. What we're going to do in the US is on some of our services, like our VPN service, for example, we're actually going to drop prices 30%, and we're going to pass on those savings to the consumers. It's the right thing to do. And I think it's important to highlight, just how abusive the Apple, tariff is and how much it is increasing the cost, right? I was telling some people in the US, like, we talk about like inflation being a problem in the US, right? This is actually, it's a problem in Europe as well.
Hmm.
Well, if you want to cut inflation, getting rid of the Apple tariff, that's a good way to start because everybody buys services online now, right? Everybody buys things on mobile.
Hmm.
And, I think practically every American is paying this indirectly. You just don't realize it.
That's, yeah, and it's a great message to say, look, we are passing on this discount or this reduction to our consumers because it was them who was paying it in the first place.
Yes, yes.
Poor Apple. I mean, it might.
I don't know. I wouldn't shed a tear for them. They have trillions in market cap, hundreds of billions in cash on the balance sheet. Honestly, they've been fleecing people for the last 20 years, right? So I think it's time that they played fair. Honestly.
100% agree with you. Why is it, Andy, do you think that the big tech behemoths are based in the US? Because occasionally people accuse me personally in my personal agitation and work of being anti-American. I'm not. I'm anti-big tech crushing the neck of small tech. It's a coincidence that big tech is largely from the US. ByteDance, of course, is not US. But is there a reason why we haven't seen any, comparably sized, comparably successful European tech companies?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting a point, and I can actually I'll tell you kind of a bit
Mhm.
more of a maybe the insight I have on this. Fundamentally, it's a first mover advantage
Right.
because the internet, if you will, was invented, let's say, in the States, not by Al Gore as he claims, but it originated in the States,
It was
right?
ARPANET, wasn't it?
Yeah, and a lot of the infrastructure companies that powered the internet revolution, whether it's chip makers or the other companies, they were originally from the States. And the reason they originated from the States was because back in those days, the other major powers, in the world, was, well, Russia and China, which was under communism back in those days, not the most innovative economies in the world, right? So I think it should not be surprising, why big tech, became big and came out of the U.S. What I think is the more relevant and interesting question is why is it that 30 years later, Europe doesn't have a comparable tech champion, whereas China, does, right?
Mhm.
So, what did China do right that Europe, got so terribly wrong? And I think it really comes down to the European political mindset around investment in the past 30 years. So the way we should look at this is politicians in Europe had a choice in the late 90s, which is the exact same choice that their Chinese counterparts had in Beijing, right? And that was, we're behind on tech. We're not, the first mover. How do we catch up? Well, the Chinese took the decision that technology is a matter of sovereignty for us. It's a matter of our future independence, and it's a matter of future economic growth. So, no matter the cost, we must build that domestically. And what Europe did differently was they said, you know what? It's going to be cheaper to buy American tech. So they traded a short-term cost savings for a long-term strategic mistake that today is costing us in Europe way more money than we have saved by adopting American tech. So it's really a difference in mindsets that caused this catastrophe, right? Because actually we were ahead of China, in fact.
Mhm.
So how did China get ahead of us? It was simply a different policy, at the government level, and this is what I think needs to change in Europe in order to turn this around, right? Every single time a government agency, a school, a university in Europe is buying from Google or Microsoft, what they are doing is they are mortgaging the economic future of the next generation of Europeans for a short-term cost savings. And this has to end. This has to end now, because in fact, we are worse off than the Chinese were 25 years ago, right? 25 years ago, the Chinese started from zero. We're starting from the negatives because we've already been captured. We are already beholden to American tech. And so it needs to change. And the way that we change this, people in Brussels say, "Oh, we need to regulate," right?
Mhm.
Brussels' answer to everything is a regulation. Well, you have the DMA now, and how well has that worked? I would say it's been a complete failure. It hasn't changed anything at all, right? So we need to approach it from a different angle. People always said, "Oh, the problem with Europe is it's a supply problem. We don't have companies that can supply, this tech that we need." But that's a misconception. The problem is not supply. The problem is actually demand, right? You don't have supply because you don't have demand. Because why? All the demand that you generate in Europe goes to American companies. You're buying American stuff. So in my opinion, the answer is to adopt policies that require public procurement, which is, again, the spending of taxpayer money to buy, European. Why should our taxpayer money that today goes to government, agencies, which then go out and buy technology, be used to subsidize American businesses? Doesn't make any sense. I think every single government contract, in the EU and in Europe, needs to go to a European company. That should just be law. And we should just do it because it's good for the economy, it's good for national security, and it's in our national interest. And so I think that's how we change the system. That's how we fix it. And we need to have the buy European mindset today.
Wow. I mean, I hear lobbying groups or citizen action groups starting to say something very similar. We need to kickstart, if you like, a European industrial revolution for our own tech. It's not like Europe lacks the talent, and it's not like you need gigantic factories to press copies of spreadsheet software. Once it's written, it's infinitely reproducible. We have lots of brains here. I think you're right. Yes, it's just people naturally go and buy Chromebooks or Microsoft Windows in government, etc.
Yes, and there's actually an industry group called Eurostack that has actually 200 companies in Europe that is focused on this, putting together policy initiatives to bring about this change. But it's the only way to do it. It's, to be honest, how the Chinese did it. The Chinese simply created demand for their own companies by locking out American players. And while we cannot mandate what private companies do, the public sector, the governments, they're spending taxpayer money. We can definitely mandate and demand, where they spend their money. And I think, for too long, European money and treasure has been subsidizing American businesses. And it's time for us to believe in our own businesses and time to subsidize our own, continent. It's honestly very, very long past due.
If you stand, I'm going to vote for you. Actually, I can't because I'm not an EU citizen anymore. But Andy, I realize I've taken up nearly the whole hour. Couple more questions. What's next then for Proton, or what can you talk about publicly that's next on the agenda for Proton?
Oh, publicly is always a little bit tricky. I would say our model is very simple, right? We're different from Google because Google is there to make advertisers happy. We don't sell ads. We don't have, venture capital shareholders. In fact, our main, stakeholder is users. It's the community. All of you out there that use our services, wherever you tell us that you want, actually we're obligated to build it for you because you are our main shareholder, our main stakeholder now. The goal of the foundation is actually to serve the world, serve the community. So anything that enough people in the community ask for, we have to build. And you hear all the usual things, right? Now that we've launched Proton Docs to replace Google Docs, people want Sheets. So probably have to do that as well, right? People say, oh, we need some more, we want secure chat services based in Europe. Okay, probably we have to do that as well, right? Now there's all the stuff going on with AI, and people are pushing, into AI. I think there's some people that say AI is surveillance, but that's like saying the web is surveillance. Right? It's true, but it's not helpful, right? It doesn't mean that that the AI or the web is going to go away. So I do think, in the privacy space, we need to figure out how we do AI in a privacy first way. And I think, we recently pushed out a new feature that allows you to do albums on Proton Drive to have all your photo albums there, right? That was also something that users demanded quite a bit. So our vision in the long run is really to build out the entire ecosystem. And that means everything that Google and Apple, have. Well, we in theory should do it as well, because if you're missing bits and pieces, it's very hard for people to migrate over, from Google's ecosystem in a Proton ecosystem. So the mission is big. It'll take us a long time. So please have some patience with this because it'll probably be another 20, maybe 30 years before we do it. But I think it's extremely important. And we're doing this also here in Europe, right? We have today 90% of our staff in Europe. And that's because I believe sooner or later, there's going to have to be a European tech giant. And this is, I think, the opportunity, because at the end of the day, who we're fighting for is actually European values.
Hmm.
And you will not be able to defend your values if you don't have the sovereignty over your own technology, right? So European values will only exist 100 years from now if we have the tech ourselves to sustain and support that. And this is ultimately what Proton is trying to do.
Wow. I mean, this is why Vivaldi, we're very excited to be partnered with Proton, because similar value proposition. You know, we have no external investors to force us to pivot or to gouge more money. If our users want something, we'll do our best to make it happen. We can't always make stuff happen as fast as people want, because lots of users mean lots of competing requests. But yeah, we're there to keep the internet free and open and not monetize people while doing it.
Yeah,
So,
and I think I'm quite excited that we were able to work together because I think European companies, there aren't that many of us, right,
mhm,
that are trying to do things the right way, and we're all quite small, at least compared today to our American and Chinese counterparts. We're going to get bigger over time, so maybe this will not be true in 10 years, but today we're all quite small. And the only way to make more progress is actually by working together. And I think that's also the strength of Europe, right? So when it comes to Eurostack, it cannot be German industrial policy or French industrial policy, right?
mhm,
It has to be all Europe industrial policy, because on our own we're too small, but together as a group, together as all the 20 plus countries, actually close to 30 countries now,
mhm.
in the EU, that is where our power lies, right? Because that is combined, we're an economy with more people, more engineers, highly educated, and actually also more spending power as well. So we have the ingredients to actually be the global leaders. Now we just need the political will to actually do it.
Well, I hope we will, and I hope before I retire that you will come and join me on my Vivaldi super yacht um, when we celebrate our billionth user. So it's an open invitation for that. My last question, Andy, because time is running out. I want to go back to particle physics, which fascinates me, as I say. Even though one of the best books I ever read is called The First 3 Minutes by Steven Weinberg. Um, so as far as I can tell, the heaviest hadron found to date at the Large Hadron Collider rejoices in the name Double Hidden Charm Tetraquark. Can we expect Proton to rebrand as Double Hidden Charm Tetraquark?
Well, this, in the tech industry, there's a famous three-syllable rule, right? If the name of your company is more than three syllables, it's probably going to fail. So, on that basis, I'm going to have to refuse this proposal.
Excellent. So once again, proof of no decay of the proton. I like it. And
Exactly.
Andy Yen, thank you so much for your time, and uh, it's really invigorating here. Other people expressing the same hopes and visions for European tech as I share personally, and Vivaldi shares organizationally. So thank you very much for being our guest, and let's meet up in 10 years' time and work out how well we've done.
Great. Thanks for having me. And, it's a pleasure to be here, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you. And thank you very much, listeners and viewers, for being with us. See you next time.